Welcome everybody, Morena. It's great to have you on board for this webinar on biophysical limits and economic growth, an issue of enormous importance for humanity. And I'd just like to thank Simon Chappell as Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies for enabling this event to take place. I'm Jonathan Boston. I'm one of the professors in the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington, and some years ago I used to run the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies, and I'm delighted that Simon is in that role now and bearing that responsibility. The issues we're going to be discussing are really important. Many of you will be very familiar with them. The process we're going to follow is as follows. So there'll be three presentations, starting with Professor Janet Stevenson of Otago University. She's the Director of the Centre for Sustainability. Janet will be followed by Dr. Mike Joy, who's a Senior Researcher in the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies and an ecologist by training with particular expertise on freshwater issues. And Mike will be followed by Dr. Geoff Bertram, who's a Senior Associate of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies, an economist, and someone who has worked extensively on a range of environmental and energy-related economic issues over his lifetime. So we'll have these three presentations. I'll then give the three presenters an opportunity to interact and just to discuss some of the matters that they've raised in their presentations. And then I'll open up the webinar for wider comment and contributions. Now, in that regard, we might just start using the chat function initially, and I'll come back and explain that a bit more when we get there. So if you want to ask a question early on in the process, please let us start with the chat function, and then after we've dealt with some of the questions on the chat function, I'll invite you to, if you wish, to put your hand up using the facility you have at the bottom of your screen, and I will go to you and invite you to make an oral contribution or respond to something that has been said. My hope is that we can work through some of the issues systematically, so that we have a kind of a thoughtful and well, systematic conversation rather than a very bitsy conversation. There are a variety of important issues, and Janet, Mike, and Geoff will be highlighting those in their presentations. Just a few other matters before we get underway. This, I hope, will be the first of a number of events on this topic area. It's an immensely important and rich topic area and needs serious analysis and discussion. So the intention is that over the coming year and beyond, the Institute will host a series of webinars covering issues in this policy space. Secondly, this webinar is being recorded, and the intention is that this recording will be made available through the Institute to people who want to listen in the future. So please just bear that in mind as you contribute. And I think that's probably all I need to say at this point. So with that, just to say welcome again to those who are attending this webinar. We'll be running for almost 2 hours. Obviously, if you need to leave, you're welcome. And I'll start with Janet and invite Janet to kick off with her presentation. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen so that we can talk our way through this. Yeah. Right, well, kia ora koutou. So I'm not an economist like Geoff or a biophysical scientist like Mike. I'm a social scientist, and as such, I'm really interested in how society grapples with the transition to a sustainable future. And really, most of my research life is focused on aspects of that question. So while I'm not an expert in economic growth by any means, I am very interested in how and why this idea of economic growth has become normalised in governments, businesses, and society generally. Normalised to the extent that to lack economic growth is unquestionably seen as a failure. So I'm going to talk about how this concept of growth has become so embedded in today's thinking and the biophysical and societal consequences of this. But first, what do we mean by economic growth? In Jonathan's invitation to contribute to this panel, he made it clear that by economic growth, he meant growing GDP. He referred to both total GDP and GDP per capita. So that is the definition that I'm going to use. And I'm putting an asterisk by that to show that is in fact what we're meaning by growth in these discussions today. But growing GDP is intimately associated with growing production and consumption and growing personal and corporate wealth. Ultimately, it is about growing financial flows through the economy. When I talk about growth today, it is with this meaning. So this asterisk is there. But let's sidestep briefly to a bathtub Earth. One way of thinking about financial flows is the flow through of real and imaginary money in and out of the bathtub. But this concept is divorced from the idea of how full the bathtub is, its stocks. Economic growth, as measured by GDP, doesn't take into account how the activities producing the flow may be depleting biodiversity, damaging natural systems that support human well-being, or creating inequities across current and future generations. This concept of stocks versus flows becomes important when we ask the question, are there biophysical limits to growth? I'm going to answer this by discussing two types of biophysical limits, what I call consequential limits and essential limits. To show what I mean by consequential limits, let's go back to around 200 years ago to the era of the Industrial Revolution. Two key things were happening which start this story. Fossil fuels replaced labour, powering technologies and enabling huge reductions in cost of production, and this together with colonisation and resource and human exploitation gave seemingly limitless potential for dramatic and ongoing growth in production, consumption and personal wealth. Over time, this idea became normalised. Growth is essential and inevitable. There are no physical limits and any risks are acceptable or can be dealt with by technology. And the growth paradigm has permeated everything we do. Cities have to grow or they're considered to be stagnant. Businesses have to grow or they're failures. Families have to grow their wealth and possessions or they're not good enough. This has had many repercussions. Global population increased, and with this, together with ongoing growth, led to more resource use and increasing waste to a scale that started damaging environmental systems, the age of the Anthropocene. Increasingly, financial flows are starting to have to be redirected to fixing the resulting environmental and social disasters, such as increasing hurricanes and floods. Together, these are leading to increasing inequality and injustices in different parts of the world, especially those that are already under financial, environmental, and humanitarian stress. And the normalisation of growth underpins the dominant economic thinking, and because it is a flow, these impacts on stocks can be ignored. Or maybe they can't anymore. We're now at a crux point where those old uncertainties are unravelling. We're facing global and local resource limits and increasing societal resistance to destructive resource exploitation. We're starting the process of replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, and many natural resources are becoming depleted or access is contested. At the other end of the chain, climate change and other environmental damages are also starting to impact on GDP. Looking to the future, all of these have disastrous health, well-being and equity implications. I suggest that consequential limits to growth following from this failing system fall into three main categories. First of all, limits to growth from the reduced availability of resources. And two examples there, one in the Sovacool paper that was shared about minerals. He points out that climate change mitigation will require very large amounts of relatively rare minerals, but they are in limited supply, but also importantly in locations that are poorly managed or sites of conflict. Another brief example, the Food FAO says that by 2050, ongoing soil erosion, the loss of another resource, may reduce crop yields up to 10%. Which is the equivalent of removing millions of hectares of land from crop production. The second consequential limit is limits to growth from environmental degradation. And here, an example or two, insurance firm Swiss Re report just out says that more than half of global GDP, $42 trillion, depends on high functioning biodiversity. It says 1/5 of the world's countries are at risk of their ecosystems collapsing because of the destruction of wildlife and habitats, and the risk of tipping points is growing. And another recent study by The Economist suggests that the global economy will be 3% smaller in 2050 than today due to climate change alone. And then there's limits to growth from increasing need for investment in disaster recovery rather than productivity. A UN report from 2 days ago says the first 20 years of this century have seen a staggering rise in climate disasters, with $2.97 trillion in losses to the global economy. These losses are unequally spread, with poorer nations impacted the worst. So all of these consequential limits impact on the potential for growth. Briefly now, I'm also going to talk about essential limits. The idea of essential limits is best shown by 3 diagrams. First of all, the work on planetary boundaries, which shows that we're already beyond the ability of some natural systems to maintain their functioning, such as biogeochemical flows and genetic diversity, and getting close with land use change and climate change. Secondly, the work on ecological footprints, which tells us we're already consuming 1.7 times what global systems can sustain, and that many nations are well beyond that, up to 5 globes equivalent, for example, for the United States, and many are seriously under that. And the concept of donut economics, which brings together the idea of ecological limits with the need to ensure that everybody gets a fair share to support social well-being. Together, these forms of analysis and others like them are concluding that to avoid destroying the natural systems that we depend on will require less consumption, less damaging production, less waste, but less biophysical destruction and less inequality. In fact, less of everything that is a hallmark of growth. And just as an interesting semi-aside, because I know Mike is going to cover this, fossil fuels are a particularly interesting case, as they are deeply implicated in both consequential and essential limits. They're a primary cause of the growth paradigm and the primary cause of climate change. But to get out of jail, we have to hand in our prize card in the growth game, which is fossil energy. So to conclude, are there biophysical limits to growth? To me, this question has 2 parts. Firstly, are our increasingly stressed biophysical systems going to constrain the possibility of continued GDP growth? And under business as usual, I think the answer is definitely yes. These are the consequential limits. The other part of the question is, do we need to shift from a growth-focused economy to achieve a planet that supports long-term human well-being? Again, the answer is yes. These are essential limits. My conclusion is that there are biophysical limits to growth on both counts. But can we imagine economy without growth? Growth as defined, measured and aspired after looks increasingly impossible and increasingly undesirable. To get to a safe and just space for humanity, as Rayworth puts it, requires first of all for us to dismantle a couple of centuries of mental conditioning. This first step might be the hardest, and that is to even imagine an economy where growth, as in ever increasing GDP, is not a fundamental expectation, and to start to consider how such an economy might operate. If we can't get to imagining this, we're condemning our future generations to an appalling future. Thank you. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Janet. That was an excellent overview. And just to welcome any people who have joined since Janet was speaking. And to note that after we've had a chance for the 3 presenters to present their material, we'll have some interaction, and then we'll move to a Q&A session for a period of time. So if you have specific questions, please feel free to begin to use the Q&A function. So Mike, it's your turn, and you'll need to unmute and then share your slides. Mike, you're still muted.
All right, okay.
Great.
Thanks, and thanks, Janet. That was fantastic. I think, you know, I'm going to cover some of the things that Janet's talked about already, but really nice framing there. I'm going to stick to science as a scientist, and I'm not going to talk about money. I'm just going to talk about the living and the non-living world, and the limits to growth that I see as sort of the, I guess, the culmination, or no, that sounds like the end, but the build up of a long time of looking at impacts of fresh water, and then having to see, at the local stream scale, and then trying to figure out what's going on at the catchment scale, and then the country scale, and then inevitably I had to look at the global scale to try and see what was going on, to understand the destruction that I could see around me. And so that's kind of how I've got into this, looking much, much deeper into, I guess as an ecologist, my training, my understanding of the world is all about interconnections and systems. And so that's kind of how I got to here, and how I'm here talking about this stuff today. So I'm going to talk about some of the examples first, and sorry, but and sort of double up a little bit on Janet, but I don't think it matters to keep hearing this stuff. And I want to talk about a lot of interactions, the feedback effects of declining net fossil energy and mineral concentrations, the energy, ecological and material constraints on transitioning away from fossil fuels, because there's some big problems coming up there. Just kind of a reality check on the decarbonising transition. And then, so first, just to kind of, this sort of thing doesn't seem to make the mainstream media, and I don't know how many people are aware of it, but scientists, I think, are inherently very conservative. And when you get this 20,000, when this warning came out, this is a follow-up warning from a warning in the 70s from a few thousand scientists. It's now well over 20,000 scientists just making this really, really clear that we're hitting limits on all kinds of things. And that statement, if the world doesn't act soon, there'll be catastrophic biodiversity loss and untold amounts of human misery. And to have that message in one ear, and to listen to politicians in the build up to the election here and in other parts of the world, and just no mention of this kind of reality. It's like there is two worlds that we live in. The planetary boundary stuff, of course, Janet put this graph up, but this little graph here also has black dots on it, and the black dots are animal agriculture's influence on those exceedances. So you can see how much animal agriculture is driving the exceedances of the planetary boundaries, just to put some of the reason behind it. The agriculture, aquaculture, fishing and forestry, so the food production side of what we do on the planet, is just becoming more and more dependent on fossil fuels, or has become and continues to become. Up to 62% of that food comes from fossil fuels now. 68% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is covered with that, and 22% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from that food production. And so how that looks when you look at the vertebrate animals on the planet, for example, only 3% of the vertebrate animals on the planet now are wild animals. The rest of the animals are humans and the animals that we eat and have as pets. So, no wonder we have a biodiversity crisis like never before, just looking at that figure alone, without even thinking about climate change and anything that's coming in the future. That's how much we dominate the planet. And of course, that means that you look at the figures for declines of animals, and this is seen first in freshwater, and maybe that's why it's so obvious to me, because everything sort of ends up first in freshwater, that we do on the land, and we get massive declines there in New Zealand as well. And of course, the human side of things. A very large proportion of the people on the planet now have many ecological threats coming at them, and water being a big one of those. Okay, so now I want to sort of move on to these. I think I could probably explain everything I want to talk about with these two pyramids here. So the first one is the resource energy pyramid, and that's the idea of, there's many ways of looking at this. I think one of the handier ones is the energy return on energy invested. And this often gets mistaken for, we talk about EROI, energy return on investment. and it's not fiscal, financial, it's purely about energy. So just the reality that we had very easy oil, I mean, just off Taranaki, it bubbled up out of the ground. We've gone from that to having to work really, really hard to get it. So the low-hanging fruit are gone, and now we're having to put more and more effort into getting the energy. And so you can see with those the effects on society with the two graphics at the bottom there. And the simplest explanation is that to get the same amount of energy, you need more energy because you're putting more energy back into getting the energy. And so that puts a squeeze on what's available for other things. And you can see the blue arrow there. Except the green arrow, the essentials doesn't change, of course, but the squeeze gets put on the discretionary energy, which I'm sure the economists can link to discretionary money. But I'll just stick with discretionary energy, and that's discretionary energy to do things like transitioning to renewables. And then there's the other resource pyramid there, the one with the minerals. So just the example given of copper there, where the sort of concentration of copper in the material that you mine goes down and down and down. So you have to mine more and more of that material to get the same amount of copper out, and so you have to put more and more energy into that. So when you think about that energy return on investment, there's domestic oil. So this graph's got sort of the amount of this energy that's available on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the energy return on investment. And so we can see just oil's been plotted over time there from 1930s at about 100 to 1, 100 units of energy to get one back, down into the 70s, and it's around 30. The bubbles are showing there's a fair bit of variability there in the calculations depending on where you're drawing the barriers. The bubble going left to right is showing that, you know, the sort of extent of what we have available. So the bubble's getting smaller a bit for oil, but the energy return from it is getting less and less and less as we have to put more energy in to getting it. I think, you know, interestingly, you can see coal up there, a big reserve there, quite a big variability, of course, in energy return, because depending on if it's shallow or deep. Hydro, quite high, hydroelectricity and biomass firewood there, coming down on that energy return. Wind turbines, photovoltaic, and right down there in the very bottom left-hand corner is the, you know, the manufactured fuels like biodiesel and biofuels that have a very low energy return on investment and very limited capability or extent of that available. Okay, so that's kind of trying to put that. I don't want to end up in, don't think it's necessary to get into arguments about the details of how you measure energy return on investment. It's just a very simple concept. There is arguments about where boundaries are drawn and how you calculate numbers for different systems, but it's just simply the fact that as resources become more depleted, you have to put more and more energy into getting them. Okay, so this really noisy kind of graph here is me trying to explain how everything that's coming up is going to require more energy. So I'm going to sort of move around. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but there's, starting with oil up in the top left-hand corner there, we're just not discovering it at anywhere near the rate that we're using it. And there's many signs, and I don't want to get into an argument but there is, or has been, or very soon will be, peak oil. We have fracking and other methods, but they have big problems with energy return on investment and the harm that's being done from them. Plus that resource pyramid there, so the energy return on energy invested going down, and so what it actually means is a net decline in fossil fuel energy available. Then, so you have also the need for carbon zero. So with climate change impacts coming that we've talked about already, we have to reduce the amount of carbon that we release to the atmosphere. So that means that we have to put more and more energy into the transition to renewables. As we transition to renewables, we need lots of energy to do that. And that just kind of feeds back on itself. The more we do that, the more energy is required. One of the mitigations that's talked about a lot, and it's in the IPCC reports, is carbon sequestration. Well, it is possible to sequester carbon, I've no doubt about that, but there is a huge energy cost in doing that. So, you know, for example, anything that I've seen so far, you're looking at around 40% of the energy that you get from the system being lost in putting it back, putting the carbon into the ground. So again, that feeds into more energy required. I mentioned before that we need to have more food production uses more fossil fuels. So we need more energy to get food the way we make it at the moment. And then there's the gadget side of things and just the stuff that we have. Per capita energy use continues to grow. It has not, it's sort of plateaued a couple of times in history, but we're still using more energy per capita than ever before. More gadgets, more things in our lives that require batteries. I mean, if you see the incredible move towards electric bicycles and scooters and battery-powered tools that builders and all kinds of tradespeople use, all that kind of thing, just more and more gadgets, all requiring more and more of those rare minerals to drive them. I don't know if you can make out the little graph up in the top right-hand corner. One's the increase in energy consumption per capita. The other one, that big expanding bars, are just the amount of material that's mined on the planet to make all these gadgets and things, the technology that we're using more and more of. And back on the left-hand corner again, that more mining required to get those minerals, both because we need more minerals for the replacing of fossil fuels and all the new gadgets, but also because we have to mine more to get the same amount of material, means more mining and there's huge biodiversity and human impacts from that mining process. So just all of these things driving in one direction, and that's the need for more energy, which then has all these other feedback loops. So just looking towards this idea of a transition towards renewable energy, I've got this little graphic here that I borrowed off Simon Michaud, who's doing a lot of work in this here, an Australian who's doing work for the Finnish government at the moment and writing some amazing reports on this stuff, where he really breaks this stuff down. But we've kind of got we've got the Raworth economic kind of system in the center there, the industrial ecosystem being fed, and the energy coming in at the top there is the size of those boxes is relative to the size of what's feeding into our current energy system at the moment. So coal, hydro, nuclear, wind and solar going into the electricity part of it, and gas and oil onto the other energy part of it. They're all energy, but we need to be careful to understand the difference between the two. Currently, globally, electricity is only 20% of our energy use. The rest of it is heat energy and used for all kinds of making of plastics and building roads and all that kind of thing that's on there. So the future is we're going to have to knock out these three things in very quickly to have a hope of surviving. So that leaves the hydro, nuclear, wind and solar as the technologies that we know of at the moment that we're going to have to ramp up, feeding into that system. Okay, I just wanted to touch on a few of those things. That hydro has a good energy return on investment, but we've dammed most of the rivers that can be dammed. There are huge biological and physical impacts, so geomorphological and biological impacts of dams, and dams are temporary. I can give you an example of one in New Zealand that I've done a lot of work on, that in the Patea Dam, that will not be a dam in another 30 years. In the first 30 years of its life, it lost half of its capacity through sedimentation, and in another 30 years, it won't be a dam anymore. That's the reality of dams, is that they stop sediment movement and so they build up. Nuclear, we've got lots of issues with nuclear. It's very slow to build it, and it's very expensive. There are many unsolved waste issues with that, but that's another option that we have. We've got wind. big installation environmental material footprint for wind, and it's intermittent, so we've got problems with it not being regular, not being constant, and the same with solar, but maybe not so big on the problems of implementing it. But down the bottom, the graph that's feeding up to on the bottom, I've got a zoom in of that. It's Micho's work, but it's basically a whole bunch of minerals there and their availability. And he's done the work. If you look on that graph at the bottom, he calculated to replace all of the transport needs for fossil fuels on the planet. So that includes ships. He didn't put in aviation because it's just not possible at the moment to come up with any kind of alternative to fossil fuels for aviation. So he left that out. But this is shipping and rail and road and cars for transport, and the global reserves are the bars in blue, and the metals needed to build the 863 million tons of lithium-ion batteries, which is what he calculated we would need to replace those fossil fuels for transportation. And you can see, you know, and there's many examples of this, of just not being, with the technology that we have currently, the available materials, minerals on the planet to be able to make that transition. And to put it, he's a geologist, and to put it into sort of reality, you know, basically roughly 7 times the cobalt, lithium, and nickel deposits that are known in the big resources for those things at the moment would have to be 7 more of each one of those things to be able to achieve that with lithium-ion batteries. Just to put that, so what is driving towards all those things that I'm talking about, those limitations with the energy return on investment of fossil fuels declining, is this idea of a Seneca cliff, or sort of upside down version of it here. But just the basic message from this is that as we transition to fuels with lower energy return on investment, you get this quite sudden change. It seems like nothing much is changing over time, and then suddenly it suddenly gets very, very difficult. And there's this idea that you need an energy return on investment of around 10 to 1 is the lowest minimum to maintain industrial civilization. And there's a few papers being done on that, but just wanted to get across the idea that it seems like nothing much is happening for a long time, and then it's very sudden when the change starts to come. I guess another way that I like this way of thinking as a way to explain it, a very simple sort of one that rolls off the tongue for the reality of the change that's needed to replace fossil fuels. So in 2018, the world consumed over 11,000 megatons of oil equivalent in fossil fuels. So that's gas and oil. To reach net zero by 2050, we've about 11,000 days till then, just to round things out. So we need to reduce by 1 megaton of oil equivalent every day from now until 2050. And likely we don't have till 2050. Plenty of studies saying that it's more like 2035 we have to have it done by. So what that works out to is, just to give you an idea of the extent of the required, you know, sort of transition, that's 1,500 large wind turbines every day. And by the way, that covers 770 odd square kilometers every day from now till 2050. Or maybe we could do that one day, and on the next day we build a large nuclear power plant every other day. Just to put that into context, there are 430 nuclear power plants on the planet at the moment. So one a day. That's just to give you an idea. That's not counting all of the material that you would have to mine. You know, I mean, you've got to build all that, the copper to connect it all up, to do all those things. Just trying to get across the reality that there's no way that we are going to transition into a world of similar energy use or more energy use than we have at the moment with any of the current technologies. And I'd still even preface that, even were some other technologies to come along, the time, the scaling up, you know, thinking that we've had 100 years to build up the infrastructure that we have at the moment, well, more than 100 years, but you know, that we just don't have the time to be able to make these kind of changes. So just to sum up, then we've already reached and surpassed many critical biophysical limits. There are all kinds of feedback effects and interactions between declining net fossil fuel, declining mineral concentrations. And what it means is we'll have less energy available. There'll be less energy for society in the future and increasing biological impacts. And just the simple material constraints of transition means very unlikely we can make it with known technology. So we have to face the fact, and I think plan for a future with way less energy. And the emphasis, to my mind, should be going on conserving energy, on, for example, building houses that don't require as much energy, concentrating on transport systems that require less material. So completely not thinking electric vehicles or anything that's going to happen along those lines, but much more radical thinking than that, to have a hope of a future that's livable. There's lots more we can talk about, and hopefully we'll get to discuss some of those things today, but that's pretty much it for me. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. That was a very comprehensive overview. I'll turn now to Geoff. Geoff has already distributed, and I hope those of you who are attending this webinar have seen his note, but Geoff is going to talk to his note, and perhaps, Geoff, you might want to respond to some of the things that Janet and Mike have said, and then I'll give Mike and Janet a chance to respond as well. Thank you.
Sure, if you better pull me up if I go beyond about 7 or 8 minutes for Jonathan, otherwise I'll talk all morning. All right, now I'm the economist here, and it's really quite, in a sense, it's a nice change not to be the dismal voice in the room. Economics used to be called the dismal science, and that was for a good reason. It was that for a long, long time, economics kept on making the sort of statements that Mike has been making about the future for humanity. But it's now 2 centuries since David Ricardo predicted that capitalism would have to come to a grinding halt because of the scarcity of land. And if you look at the actual grinding halt that he thought would come, it was a grinding halt with extreme inequality. I'd like to start by making that point, I think. When you make aspirational statements about how we might be able to rescue something out of this catastrophe, and link that to the idea that it can be an egalitarian outcome, I think that's something that you can hope desperately for, but there's a lot of economic analysis that points in a different direction, and Ricardo's one of those. Ricardo's view of the future for capitalism with fixed land, no technological progress, or in Mike's terms, it would be no technological progress sufficient to overcome the shortage of natural resources. Ricardo says, okay, those who have ownership of the scarce and declining natural resources get an increasing share of the product because they're able to collect rent on the scarcity value of those resources. The rest of the population, the workers are reduced to subsistence wages where they stay forever. And the capitalists are reduced to zero profit where they stay forever. And the stationary state is one where the system simply reproduces itself, effectively becoming feudal again. In other words, if you think about the social structure that goes with Ricardo's vision of a stationary state, it's a feudal one with a land owning elite, or in the 21st century context, a natural resource owning elite, collecting the greatest share of the product, and the rest of the population on subsistence, whatever they can scrounge. And so if you're thinking about the future that Mike implicitly is sketching out, it's a future in which Ricardian checks and balances come to play for the great majority of humanity, who live at a level of life that can be sustained with non-fossil energy. Basically human and animal energy, that means, plus whatever you can maybe harvest from wind and solar. But if Mike is right about the diminishing returns that apply to producing wind and solar, then you have again to think about quite low levels of energy consumption. So it's the Ricardian outlook is a highly inegalitarian one, and a stationary state where capitalism has to cease to be a forward-moving system. That's 200 years ago. And a lot of economists signed up to the Ricardian vision. Diminishing returns remain central to the economic view of the world. And yet 2 centuries on, there are very few people in economics who any longer adhere to that Ricardian vision, even though Mike's vision of the coming end of the world is compelling, grounded in good science, plenty of solid numbers there. And yet economists en masse just aren't flocking to that. They're not flocking to it because the profession's experience was in the 19th century to essentially say the end of the world is nigh, and to set out reasons why it is nigh, and to forecast various outcomes from the coming crises. And then the 20th century was a century where those crises went away. And the profession, as a result, got less and less dismal and more persuaded that our visions of doom haven't stacked up. So maybe other people's visions of doom won't stack up either. And so now you have a problem that the entire intellectual culture in economics has moved from technological pessimism to technological hyper-optimism. And economists are therefore very difficult now to persuade that the end of the world is really nigh, because of a century of empirical observation of the end of the world getting deferred over and over and over and over and over again by unexpected, unforeseen things that happened. So I want to start with, what seems to me a basic truth. If something can't go on forever, it'll stop. In other words, an unsustainable path cannot be sustained. All right, so the really crucial question over and over and over and over again is, if you're on an unsustainable path, where does it stop? How does it stop? And what comes after the stopping? And there are essentially 2 things, it seems to me, that can happen at the end of an unsustainable path. One is collapse. And Jared Diamond has written a large book studying various systems where the human failure to adapt to real constraints that they faced produced a crisis and a collapse. So yes, there's plenty of historical cases where we've done that, and it may well be that on a global scale we're about to do it again. I can't argue against the scientific stuff and the engineering stuff that Mike has to offer you. It all looks compelling. So that's one thing that one way you can end in collapse, and we can talk a little bit about what happens after the collapse. The other thing that can happen is you adapt, and the adapted system is one which explicitly works within the limits that it is given. And Mike sketched out a couple of ways in which you might start thinking about that. It requires an intensely planned approach to the management of resources, and maintaining that intensely planned approach and enforcing the constraints that have to be observed is not a trivial exercise, and it's not clear that it is compatible with democratic political processes as we know them. There is, I suspect, quite a lot of human history that suggests that unless we get a Platonic philosopher king to run the show, it's going to be politically quite repressive, relying on a dominant elite to enforce its dictates relating to the observation of limits. Now, in terms of how you might think about that, let me just offer you one. Before European contact in the Pacific Islands, there were very clear limits to the population expansion of the islander population. And the Pacific Islands were colonized over a long period of time by migrations, which moved in waves out to island after island after island. And as the population on each settled island reached the limits that that island could support, there were 2 processes that over and over and over again came into play. One, onward migration. A bunch of folk get on a canoe and go looking for another island, and that's the expanding frontier way out. And the other one, population control. Very largely by infanticide, by the way, because the technology for birth control was not particularly well developed in pre-European contact Polynesia, but infanticide was a clear-cut, very efficient and socially accepted and socially enforced way of holding population within biophysical limits. So we know that human societies have done that adaptation in various situations, and we know human societies have done collapse in various situations. We need to ask ourselves, for the global community in the 21st century, one, are we really up against it? Okay, and I have an open mind on that still. Two, if we are up against it, if Mike is right, is it crash and burn, or is it step back to a way of running our human community on this planet within those physical limits, with the costs that that entails in terms of domination of some political authority that can enforce behaviour within the limits, and potentially highly unequal access to resources. In other words, the systematic exclusion of the great mass of the human population from access to the standards of living and well-being that rest upon access to the increasingly scarce resources. Now, this means economics, it seems to me, once we start engaging seriously with the questions that are being put up here, becomes, again, a very dismal science. So the 3 points that I'd put on my notes is, the first one is, we as economists came to this particular issue 2 centuries ago and worked on how the thing could end, and came up with stories. The Ricardian story of a highly unequal, essentially static feudal system in which a resource-owning elite commands the greatest share of the product and the standard of living, and the rest of the population goes to subsistence, with Malthusian checks and balances to limit population. The Marx's vision of a capitalism which was inherently unstable and unable to survive in the absence of growth, and in the pursuit of growth and profit inevitably created so much inequality that it became unsustainable politically and socially, and collapsed in a revolutionary conjuncture. And after the revolution, Marx was a technological optimist, by the way. The forces of production and Marx go inexorably forward always, so there is always in Marx a technological solution. Just to get to it, you have to overthrow capitalism. And then there's John Stuart Mill, who has what I think Janet is talking about, a stationary state where capitalism settles at a high level of living into a civilized, reasonably egalitarian world where people have spare time and leisure to cultivate the arts and to live a civilized existence. And John Stuart Mill's vision reappears in Walt Rostow's stages of growth theory, where after a steep rise from takeoff and the drive to maturity, you reach what is in Rostow essentially a stationary state, which is American consumerism as of about 1955. Everybody comfortable, and nuclear families living in houses with 2 cars in the garage and so on. So first point is, we have been here, and economists have spent a lot of time thinking through what the post-crisis economy would look like, whether it could be a capitalist economy, whether it could be a socialist economy, whether it could be a feudal economy, how egalitarian it might be, how much population it could sustain, at what level it can sustain that population. And after all those 2 centuries of chewing on this, I don't have an answer for you. Now, that's the first 2 points really that I made in my thing. And the third point is that doesn't mean economists are denying all of these processes, though a lot of them are. Typically, any economist that you get on the regular radio to comment on this sort of stuff will say, oh, technological progress will see us through, it's all right, we'll find a way. In other words, there's a high degree of what I think is probably unwarranted optimism is dragged out by economists. But remember that we are apologists for the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie doesn't like to confess that it's out of ideas. So professionally, economists have a strong incentive to offer you substitutability, technological progress, human adaptability as our answers to what otherwise looks like a terrifyingly end of the world sort of outcome. And so just two things I wanted to say before I knock off, because I've been talking too long now, as I tend to. The first one is about Janet's point about growth and GDP. Now, a lot of non-economists have an unduly solid vision of what GDP has to be. But GDP is a money magnitude, and money is a terrifically fluid thing. And so if indeed 20 years from now, the main activity in which the human race is engaged is saving the planet in order for us to survive, that will be GDP. There will be vast amounts of money and human time and thinking and technology being devoted to the task of saving the planet. That doesn't mean growth will stop at all. I mean, in GDP terms, growth will be rocketing up. Vast amounts will be being spent on this project. In terms of the sort of things that Mike is talking about, you know, actually maintaining ecological systems and so on. There's a huge amount of human endeavour can go into that and can be valued for going into that, and can therefore count as GDP. So growth could be 20 years from now completely aimed in a different direction and be completely different from what you think of as growth today. And that's why money is such a very, very dangerous thing to try to use as a thing into which you convert physical magnitudes. And this is the adaptability of capitalism, I guess, that I'm referring to. So, and the other thing that I wanted to comment on is the difficulty of holding two things in your mind at the same time, which don't fit together well. On the one hand, and the international agencies are guilty of doing this a great deal. The United Nations latest report on the catastrophe in front of us, for example, is a good case in point. On the one hand, yes, the disaster is here. Mike is correct. The world is facing a catastrophe brought on by putting too much pressure against the biophysical limits that we confront. And over here, there is technological optimism, but it is still feasible to get out of this. And so long as you've got those two things, the end of the world is nigh, but we can get out of it. It produces a political paralysis in a way, because the imperative to act rests upon the idea that it's feasible to act, and yet it's increasingly hard to be optimistic about the feasibility of acting. But if you can't believe in the feasibility of getting out of this, then your incentive to do something about it sort of fades away, and you will tend to live in the present only and try to ignore the future. Things that we cannot imagine overcoming psychologically are very difficult to engage with. And so I think the challenge for people, for Mike, and indeed for, you know, the donut economics people, the circular economy people, is to find a way out of that psychological impossibility position. It's not enough just to be able to say, look, we have the technological ability to get out of this. You have to, and I think Jonathan's going to come back at this, you have to see the mechanisms by which we would actually implement those possibilities. Right?
Right, Geoff. Okay, thank you. That was a long 7 minutes, but some good stuff, important stuff. So thank you all three. I'd just like to give Janet and Mike perhaps an opportunity to respond to Geoff or to make any other additional comments, and we'll then go to the comments that are coming through in the chat session. People can use the Q&A facility if you wish, and then after perhaps say 15 minutes or so, I'll give people the opportunity to use the hand function, and then I can click on to the person who's put their hand up, and you can speak, make a comment, or pose a question. But let's just start with some responses, Janet and Mike, if you can unmute. And Janet, would you like to go first?
Yeah, and thank you both, Mike and Geoff, for really stimulating ideas. And Geoff, I'd like to actually start by asking you a question, and it's really about the minds of economists globally. Clearly, you're suggesting that there is a lot of sort of current pushback on accepting the idea that there might be problems that are questioning some fundamental expectations about growth, or the kind of growth we're used to. So, yeah, it's kind of a two-part question. If we are facing a future in which economists think that there may be some changes coming up, but they're not sure. But if the scale of these changes is so potentially huge that it could really have enormous impacts on human society, why would they not be grappling with that issue in a very fundamental way? And don't forget to unmute. If they are not, or if they are, I would be interested in maybe you talking a little bit about who are the economists on the edge who are really pushing ideas in a different direction, and what are some of those ideas? Not in a long way, but just to introduce those ideas to the audience. I mean, I've read a little of this, but it would be good to get some feedback from you on that.
So Janet, that was to Geoff?
Yes, it was.
Yes. All right. So Geoff, would you like to respond, but perhaps reasonably specifically, and I'll go to Mike.
Needs to come back to. Well, there are not many economists going down the paths that I was sketching. There are a lot of economists who are trying to frame the optimistic. Yes, it is technologically feasible. Yes, here's how we would do it. And you listed some of them, the Kate Raworths of the world, who say, yes, here is how it can be done. But whether in fact any of them first have solutions that are technically feasible within the limits. I think Mike might be pessimistic about that. And B, whether they can point you towards how to actually make those possibilities actual. Now, Simon Chappell's got a question that he put up about the incentives. It's all a matter of prices, he said. If you get the prices right, capitalist economies will respond to prices. And I think there's a lot going for that. I think that 30 years ago, if we had put serious prices on carbon and really given strong incentives for the capitalist economy to adjust to a new set of relative prices, we would today be in a much better position to address what's coming. I think having thrown away a whole generation of opportunities to use the price mechanism to move the system forward, an increasing number, I suspect, of economists are now looking at physical limitation mechanisms, quotas, rationing, and so on, enforced by central dictate, so that the economy, rather than responding to price signals, has to create its own price signals in order to confront imposed barriers. And examples of the sort of thing that I'm talking about: a ban on all internal combustion vehicles on our roads. Ban, full stop. Basically you declare the existing vehicle fleet obsolete, let people scavenge it for whatever useful bits they can get from it, but you stop entirely the use of fossil fuels for personal transport. A ban on nitrate fertilizers, one for Mike. A ban on, basically, as you start making explicit political constraints to which the market has to adjust, the market will indeed adjust. And indeed, a lot of people will make profits adjusting, and a huge amount of people will scream blue murder about the expropriation of wealth that is involved in the imposition of limits. But it seems to me we're now in a position where that is where the interesting economic work is to be done. It is in how the price system responds to the imposition of limits. And you can do general equilibrium modeling on this, in which you simply tell the model there is the limit, and the model will go off and recalculate prices until it has managed to reconcile the resulting stresses.
Thank you, Geoff. I mean, can I just add a comment that, and there's others who are listening into this who know more about this than I, but there are journals like the Journal of Ecological Economics, where there's a whole group of people, highly trained economists working on an economics that takes biophysical limits very seriously and is thinking about the various issues Geoff, you and Janet and Mike have raised: substitutability, adaptability, technological progress and the limits to that, and so on and so on. Mike, did you have a comment or question either for Janet or Geoff? And if so, please fire away.
Yeah, I just to Geoff, thanks very much for that explanation. It's kind of like a cry wolf story, and and Ricardo, starting with Ricardo. But I guess that, I'm not sure of the exact timing of this, but as far as I can tell, all of these things, when people got it wrong, it was because we just kept finding more and more, we kept being able to use more and more fossil fuels. All of this growth has been driven by fossil fuels. So I think that the cry wolf story ends when we don't have fossil fuels to enable that. That's just, my little take on that. And I was interested in I think we see, the disaster is here versus the techno-optimism that you described, and I totally see how that puts the political parties and politics into this really space where they can't really move because they're stuck between those two things. To me, the techno-optimism is the most dangerous thing, because it means that, because most of the people I speak to on the street, they don't think we have to do anything because we're just going to transition to renewables. Daily I've got a news feed that comes out with a headline of 5 a day, things like lemon peels. You can make electricity from lemon peels. We'll be able to power the world with lemons, and idiotic things like that are very, very. People want to hear them. I totally get that. They want to hear it. They want this magic, and they want to believe that it's available. And there are a huge number of people who are going to profit from coming up with these stories. The whole green hydrogen is the latest one. That's just a complete scam that everybody is jumping in on and investing in, or I think people are chasing investment. So I think you saw the disaster is here as being a problem for leading to disengagement, and I see the techno-optimism as leading to disengagement, but it's probably a bit of both in those two things there. But but anyway, thanks very much for that explanation about the sort of economist view of the world. It makes it much clearer to me.
Geoff, did you want to comment, or should we go to the questions in chat session?
Go on to the questions, Jonathan, because there's things coming up in the chat that are worth looking at.
Yes. So there's quite a few comments on the chat, and there's a number of people also putting their hands up. But let me just go to the chat first. We probably won't be able to go through everything, but question from Robert McLaughlin, Janet. I don't know if you can see that. Janet, the question is, some say that rising inequality and injustice is related to globalization, global capitalism and finance, etc. But maybe globalization is a consequence of biophysical limits. So can New Zealand make moves towards sustainability without also moving against globalization? And then there's a question here also from Mike, from Robert. When energy was cheap and the energy return on energy invested was high, a lot of energy was wasted. We still waste a lot of energy in cars. Some people call flying to Bali and etc. a waste. Is pricing energy and regulating its use a component of the way forward? In other words, I presume part of the solution potentially might be a much more efficient use of energy. So we don't need as much energy. If we have energy efficient buildings, for example, that need very little energy, well then the constraint is somewhat reduced because we simply don't need as much. So Janet, did you want to comment, or Geoff, on the first part, and then Mike on the second part?
Well, my response to the first question is, I mean, Robert's saying maybe globalization is a consequence of biophysical limits. I think globalization is actually a consequence of a belief that there are no biophysical limits, and hence we have the issues that we have today. But I think the move, talking about moving against globalization, I think it's very interesting that the COVID experience has actually triggered a quite different way of thinking about global systems and localization. I think globally, and certainly in New Zealand, there's a much greater awareness of the dangers of being so dependent on global supply chains, which can break down global markets. The global flow through of tourists, etc., are now seen as more risky, I think, than they were before. And I think that kind of flick in understanding is going to have quite strong ripples from here out. And certainly a lot of conversations I've seen have been about how do we become more localized, more resilient at a local scale, both within national boundaries and also within regional and local boundaries. So, and I think those ways of thinking actually are useful because in terms of this bigger picture that we're talking about, they enable people to grapple more closely with their local environments and with the relationship with the quality of those local environments, I would hope, at least.
Thanks, Janet. Geoff?
Yeah, I mean, Robert's point is, do you have to turn away from globalization? And I think I'd make the point that if you apply the Ricardian story I was talking about before on a global scale and ask, suppose we move to essentially a neo-feudal world where a small elite continue to enjoy high levels of well-being and the great mass of humanity are put at a much lower standard of living. New Zealand probably is almost entirely within the global elite. The inequality that I was talking about would be more an inequality between New Zealand as the renewable energy based island and the rest of the world, in a sense. And so when you talk about cutting us off from globalization, it's really a matter of insulating our little particular bit of the global elite from the wider consequences of the biophysical limits being hit elsewhere in the world, where they don't have lots of hydroelectricity, where they don't have as much wind blowing past, and so on. And so it's really important to frame in your mind whether the long run outcome for New Zealand is to be protecting our own little patch of relatively affluent ongoing survival in a much wider world where other forces will be at work. And we're pretty small relative to that wider world. You've just got to hope that it's a wider world where the rest of humanity takes its fate lying down rather than gets up and does something about it.
Well, thanks, Geoff. I mean, just a comment from me would be to say we in a globalized world that we're in, there are enormous interdependencies, as Mike was referring to in his presentation, and hence, splendid isolation becomes impossible. And COVID has highlighted that, as Janet has mentioned. Mike, a comment from you on that energy return on energy invested point.
Yeah, no, I would not. I just think that we did waste, and we are still wasting a huge amount of energy of such an incredible resource that we won't be able to use much longer. So, if I could control it, would just completely divert all fossil fuel energy from this day onwards to transitioning to making our, making buildings and everything else that are much more energy efficient. And, just there's no way, we've got to get energy out of food production and energy out of life in general and everything we do. So no more cruise ships, no more jet airliners and stupid holidays just for the sake of it. It would have to be all put into the possibility of transitioning, to a sustainable, energy sustainable future.
Well, Mike, just on that, the next question actually is very relevant. Actually, it's from Murray Grimwood, and it's about what will money be spent on if there is less being done via less energy, doing less work, and so on. Is it going to mean a percentage is spent virtually? And as you were saying, no more cruise ships, no more flying, etc. I was reminded of the fact that we now have these virtual plane trips that various companies have organized. So you just get on a mock plane and you go somewhere for your plane trip and you see all sorts of fantastic scenery, but you don't actually leave the ground. So do you want to comment on that, Mike?
Yeah, just quickly, I do, because I had a really interesting conversation with Richard Taylor the other night, the Weta guy. He gave a presentation to a group that I was at about the future, he sees the future for New Zealand very much, and part of the future being that the arts and the production of films and all kinds of things, and telling the New Zealand story, and a product that doesn't need an aircraft to fly it or anything like that. It's just this amazing electronic thing that's worth lots and lots of money, and you share it through this magic web thing. And the only thing that we did, the only caution with that is this virtual world requires energy. It doesn't come energy free. It's massively energy intensive. Those huge server farms, the more and more data that we have in this virtual space, wherever we collect it, and all the devices that we have to share it and to watch it, have a huge footprint as well. And so there is a limit to that.
Sure, though I imagine flying virtually is less carbon intensive than flying for real. All right. Now, there's a few more questions and there's a number of hands. Simon, you've made a comment here, and since you actually are part of the hosting of this, Simon, did you want to unmute yourself and make a comment? Because you're welcome if you wish.
No, I'm good with the question. All I will say about the question is it's not simply about relative prices as a solution. It's an issue of dealing with vested interests whose profits are determined by maintenance of the status quo, and how you deal with those, the political economy of those actors.
Yeah, so does anybody want to comment on that? The politics of this are as dismal, if you like, as perhaps the ecology and the economics.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to agree with Simon. The modern democracy is not at this point in time good at dealing with large vested interests. But I think there's a growing awareness that we are going to have to deal with those vested interests. And there's a whole series of fronts on which confronting large corporate organized lobbying power is getting talked about. Antitrust is one of those, and you can see the American Congress at the moment squaring up against Amazon and Google. We're going to learn quite a lot of political lessons from that confrontation about what the power of an elected body actually is in the face of organized and deliberately strategically deployed corporate muscle. The same applies to the fossil fuel lobby versus the institutions that are that are set up to deal with climate change. And in New Zealand, our debate around the emissions trading scheme, for example, is a perfect example of precisely the political economy problem, that we have all sorts of nominal things set up which enable Jacinda to cover herself with with claims about being world leading on the climate change front, but there is no substance there because every one of those instruments has been undermined and captured by the big vested interests that actually dominate climate change policy. How do we climb out of that? I mean, that's our own local little democratic experiment, whether in fact we can nail to the wall the big interests that are bullying their way to a failure of climate policy in New Zealand. And I'm genuinely open-minded about that. I don't know what the answer is, but with the Greens polling at 5% and ACT polling higher, we've got quite a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the political unpalatability of this makes it incredibly difficult because we have populations who for generations have been living on the expectation that the next generation will be wealthier, we will have more, we will fly not only to Bali but maybe to the moon. I mean, all of these expectations have kept growing, and it is a sociological problem just as much as it is a problem of vested interest, I think. And so at some point, we're either going to have to come to a juddering halt with some of the experiences of these biophysical limits to growth, or there's going to have to be some event which triggers thinking in a new way. And COVID has been quite powerful in doing that, in that it has I guess given us the confidence that a big challenge can be faced collectively, but whether we can translate those learnings to this much bigger and ongoing picture is another question.
And indeed, Janet, on that, the comparison with COVID, while it has some merit, also has some demerit in the sense that COVID is a very urgent, dramatic, life-threatening challenge now, whereas the problem with the various ecological limits we face is that they're kind of less immediate, less apparent to many people, less evident that my individual life is at stake, and so on, which makes the politics of addressing these things much more difficult. Now, look, I thought maybe at this point there are various other comments in the chat session, but I see there's 4 hands up at the moment, and I thought maybe we would just bring some other folk into the conversation, if that's all right. So, Rafe, if you're there, I can allow you to talk, and you can make a comment or ask a question, and then I'll go through. There's Lisa, Jack, and Arthur, and then maybe we come back to the comments, or there may be further hands. So let's go to you, Rafe, if you'd like to unmute and make a comment.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. Yeah, look, building off something Geoff was saying about the ability of economics to adapt to these issues, or help us adapt to these issues by adjusting prices. I sort of agree in principle, Geoff. That's what as an economist, I liked. I was brought up to think, but the reality is that any attempt we make to adapt prices tends to run into the problem of vested interests, as you've indicated. But it's worse than that. That becomes a complete blockage. So if you take the example of climate change, we've had attempts to introduce an ETS, which has generated modest prices, but the sort of prices we need in that area to indicate the damage cost of what we're doing around burning fossil fuels, for example, is around $600 or $1,000 per tonne. It's not $35 per tonne. So the political system can generate low prices, but not the sort of prices we need to make the adjustments we need. In fact, climate change is the ultimate example, really, because I agree with Mike that we do have a massive problem of using up fossil energy, using up energy in other forms. But the real constraint in terms of fossil fuels is actually the climate change problem, because we'll run out of atmospheric space long before we run out of fossil fuels. what we see with the growing climate change problem is that within 50 years, we will have a massive heat problem. Just one manifestation of climate change. Scientists are now talking about 3 or 4 billion people living in insufferable conditions within 50 years, and that is going to completely collapse civilization. When you don't have 1 billion people or more, 1 to 3, living in temperatures of over 30 degrees without huge political ramifications and migration problems. So these are much faster moving, incidentally, than sea level rise as an issue. So I think the sort of collapse of democratic governance that is likely to come with lots of people knocking on the door at the border will confront us very soon and long before we really run out of energy. So that sounds a bit grim, but I think the climate problem is a good demonstration of the incapacity of price adjustments to deal with the problem, and it's shortly and rapidly followed by the incapacity of the political system, democratic systems in particular, to adjust quickly enough to deal with the problems we face.
Thanks, Rafe. That adds to the dismal side of the equation. Janet, Geoff, or Mike, did you want to respond at all?
Well, I'll agree with Rafe, but just emphasise that when you're looking at the price mechanism, it's a matter of magnitude and timing. And if you want the price mechanism, that is, if you want to do things by carbon taxes, for example, to work, then you have to allow a time frame within which response to the economic incentives can take place, and you have to put a strong enough signal in at the outset to make sure that you get that response. So starting 30 years ago, I wanted to see us get a carbon tax on, which by now would almost certainly have gone to the range that Rafe is talking about, hundreds of dollars a tonne. It could well have started at $5 or $10 or $20 a tonne back in 1989, 1990, and escalated steadily up. And as it did so, it would have generated a growing incentive with plenty of time for investment to take place in response to it. Now I believe that we're past the point where the price mechanism is actually going to be the answer. Sticking on a $600 a tonne carbon tax now just produces a lot of chaos. We're at the point now where quantity instruments are almost unavoidable if we're serious about dealing with climate change. And the pricing system will then throw up whatever shadow prices are implied by the quantities that we set.
And yet the kind of regulatory instruments that you're foreshadowing, Geoff, that we need are going to be also extremely difficult politically. Yeah. Janet, Mike, or should we go to Lisa? Okay, Lisa, I'm allowing you to talk. If you unmute yourself, and please feel free to make a comment or ask a question.
Thanks, everybody. This has been just a wonderful morning. I'd like to say that of all the bad news I heard today, the most depressing sentence was the one that Mike said about being a scientist. Remember, he said, I'm going to be a scientist and talk about science. I'm not going to talk about money. And I really worry that our very best scientists don't have faith in our capacity as social scientists to understand things that work and things that don't in terms of organization. We can see in this conversation that people have repeatedly said, we just said, well, particularly democratic systems are not good at constraining elites. What evidence do we have for this? What evidence do we have that non-democratic systems are worse at managing the rationing of resources? We don't have any evidence of this. I was really encouraged by Geoff's recent points talking about observing the American Congress trying to take antitrust steps, looking at the experiment happening in New Zealand with the manifestly inadequate but still interesting ETS. That's a social scientific perspective. We know that we can constrain our institutions. Capitalism that's given this is not the same as piracy. It's required organization to succeed. We know that we can affect these things. So early on, Geoff was talking about waiting for the Platonic philosopher kings. We already have those. They're not doing too well. Let's not look for elite leadership on this. There's good evidence that more democratic decision-making, especially taking into account the views of people that we haven't been talking about today, the people who are already experiencing these things on their bodies, would actually give us better policy outcomes. So I'm really hoping that we'll be evidence-based about our organizations and not dismiss democracy when we haven't even tried it.
Well, thank you, Lisa. There's a provocative set of comments. Anybody want to reply to that or respond?
I just wanted to quickly respond to me. I keep away from money or because of the company that I'm in this discussion, but because I see it as something incredibly abstract, and when I look at, I can understand science, but I can't understand, for example, why the share market's going up at the moment. So that's why I decided to steer clear of it, because I just don't understand it.
Right, Janet?
Yes, Lisa, thank you for that. And that's a wonderful challenge, and it pleases me that you take a positive stance on this, and I completely agree that there are possibilities to do things beyond the human imagination in terms of engagement and collective action. But I just want to pick up on Mike's point about understanding money. It is, I think, where I started my talk was to specifically try and hone in on the very question that Jonathan had asked us, which was around economic growth, which economic growth as in GDP increase and GDP per capita. And as a non-economist, when I look at money, I'm completely baffled about how we look at these financial flows and what they're made up of. So we've got financial flows that go completely into investment bubbles and mean nothing at all. They're in futures markets. They're in property that has inflated value. And then you have financial flows increasingly, as Geoff's already mentioned, that are going to be going into things like fixing environmental disasters. And that's counted as a positive in terms of GDP flow. And then we have maybe some financial flows that ultimately might go and build healthy societies and healthy environments, which is kind of the stock element of financial flows. One thing that really worries me is that by focusing on GDP as a monolith, we're conflating all of those things into the same space and not making use of where those flows actually regenerating environments and supporting social well-being and community well-being. And that's a question I think that ecological economists and others are grappling with, but it still is the dominant trope. If you look at a media article about the state of the economy, it will always talk about GDP, and that is all of those weird flows that actually add nothing at all to the sum of human well-being.
I'd like to just say thanks, Lisa. I agree with the aspiration you have for democracy to be the way in which we can implement controls on elites. And yes, in my cheerful moments, I think that maybe that is indeed the way forward. I do think it's important to remember that the democratic program that developed in the 18th century with the Enlightenment really had an apogee in the 20th century when we've developed the welfare state and curbed capitalism and brought in serious taxation of wealth and established egalitarian goals and passed the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and all of those things. That wave of democratic aspiration and achievement has fallen on hard times in the last 50 years. And it's not just a failure of the will of ordinary people to be democratically effective. What has happened is a consolidation of the counter-revolutionary ability of large-scale wealth and power to beat back democratic challenges. And to revive the democratic challenge to wealth and power is not a trivial activity. It does require an awful lot of mobilization, and it requires some basis in shared objective interests. And you know, the organisation of the working class and of women and all of those things that gave us the democratic surge in the 20th century needs to be reproduced in the 21st if we're going to get a democratic way through this. Otherwise, you know, we are going to end up with the Chinese model. And I know which I prefer in terms of livability and philosophical niceness, but there may or may not be a trade-off between that and effectiveness. And I can't give you an answer to that because I don't know where democracy is going this century.
Mm. Thank you, Geoff. Although we can be pretty confident democracy is under lots of strains and stresses, and there's more to come, as Rafe was highlighting as well. Look, there's several more people with hands up, so I'll take them, and then perhaps we'll go back to the chat session. Jack, you're welcome to contribute if you'd like to unmute.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the folks that organized this. This is an incredibly important discussion. And I was very pleased to hear you say that it's going to continue, because there are so many aspects to this, it's hard to know quite where to respond to. And I'd like to make a comment about the whole democracy issue and the capture of elites and so on by decision makers, but I'd also like to come back to some simple concepts. And you know, Geoff mentioned the role of the market and supply and demand and pricing mechanisms. And obviously the market is an incredibly powerful and useful tool for allocating resources. But it also has some deficits, some defects. And I think they're very evident if we look at the history of environmental problems, whether it's been DDT, acid rain, ozone depletion, or even social problems, health-related like smoking. These issues that scientists raised and provided evidence for were resisted, and it often took decades for the market to adjust. And that suggests to me that, you know, waiting for problems to emerge when there's evidence that they exist is a conceptual framework that is flawed. And Jonathan mentioned ecological economics, and my imperfect understanding of economics in general, but that as well, is that there's an attempt there in ecological economics, which is a fairly rigorous conceptual framework, to contain, to put limits, the kinds of limits that Geoff was talking about, whether it's rationing or quotas, as an integral part of decision making rather than as an afterthought. You know, we have data, we have a precautionary principle that can be applied in these circumstances to help us anticipate the kinds of problems we might have if we go down a particular path. And I think that it speaks to the need to reconceptualize how we think about economics. If economics is going to serve us well, as it has in the past, we need it to be compatible with the hard sciences. It can't be, you know, these incompatible thoughts that Geoff mentioned. To me, they should be a stimulus for saying, how do we integrate this knowledge? We can't simply accept the fact that they're dissonant and go on with our lives and our decision making. So again, I think we have to come back to reconceptualizing economics and ensuring that it's compatible with the hard science. The second point I'd like to make with respect to the difficulty.
Jack, if you could be reasonably brief, if that's all right.
I shall. I simply want to say that in terms of decision making and the power of elites, there's a whole range of mechanisms in deliberative democracy, such as citizens' assemblies, which to me are opportunities to have a truly democratic inputs, because they're informed, people have good information, it's facilitated so certain parties can't dominate or use their power. So we do have mechanisms to do these things. And there's more to be said, obviously, but I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. So really two big issues there, one around reconceptualizing aspects of the discipline of economics, and perhaps, Geoff, the discipline of economics taking biophysical constraints more seriously, and the evidence of the sciences and so on, and then the issue of really governance mechanisms and the extent to which new means of democratic discourse and decision making can potentially help us in the current circumstances. Anybody want to comment on those two aspects? Geoff?
Well, yeah, I worry about people who want to reconceptualize economics as they see it, because there's a terrific amount of good solid stuff in economics, technically speaking. What's gone wrong in economics is not that the tools aren't there. What's gone wrong is that the discipline repeatedly is ideologically captured, for the same reasons that democracy is up against difficulty. The incentives that economists have, the attitudes that they tend to acquire, the company that they tend to keep, all have a malignant effect on the willingness of the profession. It's more the willingness of the profession to engage with this stuff, not the ability. If we could persuade economists en masse to seriously get into this, I think you'd find that there's plenty of good equipment in the economic toolbox to use. And you know, when I think about putting on quantity limits as a matter of dealing with climate change, I don't have any difficulty finding plenty of ways then of following through the adjustments that would result from that, and the incentives that would set up for players in the economic sphere. The difficulty, I think, is ideological rather than technical, put it that way.
Can I add to that? I think another aspect of the problem is the godlike status that economists have in critical aspects of government, and when you look at many departments, absolutely critical departments, people come from that ideologically captured area of economics, unfortunately, and have an overbearing influence on the way things are thought about, the limits around thinking, and my plea would be for government to reach out much more broadly into other disciplines, and to first of all encourage economists and other disciplines to talk to each other much more closely, but also tend to start to equalise the influence of economists versus other disciplines.
All right. Well, look, I mean, just a quick comment, and then I'll bring in actually one of our leading economists, Arthur Grimes. But just to say, obviously, the discipline of economics, Geoff, as you're well aware, traverses people with a wide range of philosophical perspectives. You know, you mentioned Marx before, but you know, in the contemporary environment, there are very distinguished economists who've been grappling with the issues that we're talking about today. People like Lord Stern, Stiglitz, Sen, and many others, and their views would be, I think, probably a little more compatible, Geoff, with yours and those of Mike and so on than many other economists. So it's not as if there's a unitary view here. There's a vigorous discourse within economics, but I guess it's a question of who carries the influence of the discipline, and who do political leaders listen to. Arthur, let me unmute you, and well, at least I can let you speak, and you'll just need to unmute yourself, which you have. So please comment in whatever way you wish.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, panel. First of all, can I just make one very brief comment and then a question? The comment, I think, is that economists have been grappling with these issues for decades. If you go back to the 70s, Nordhaus and Tobin, both Nobel Prize winners, wrote about this, called for the need to address these issues back then. Before them, Kuznets did. There's another Nobel Prize winner before them, Pigou, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century. I mean, this is something economists have been dealing with for many decades in the academic sphere. It's the people in government that have been ignoring economists, who've been talking about this for decades. Most people who actually work as economists in government are not economists. they don't have strong economics training. So, Janet, contrary to your view, actually we have very, very few people with economics training in any of the major departments of government. So that's the real lack, is they don't understand what academic economists have been saying for many, many decades now. So that's the comment. But Janet, can I come to your point about needing a change in mindset about economic growth? And I want to bring it down to the individual level. And I have this problem about framing this in terms of GDP per capita, which was not your fault, but the idea that we've got to have a change in mindset. Can I think of a young person coming out of training, and I'll give an anecdote. My son, he's a musician, and he's about to put out his first single on Spotify. If he doesn't sell anything, he won't contribute to economic growth. If he manages to sell some of his songs on Spotify, a small amount, he'll be contributing to economic growth. If he sells a huge number of that song, he'll be contributing even more to economic growth. Now, what should we tell that young person? Should we say to him, no, please don't aspire to actually have a hit song. Please just do nothing and sit there and play your tune to your friend, and it won't count for economic growth? Or should we say, no, let's be aspirational and actually go out and produce something? I mean, I find it, can you imagine being a young person now and being told, don't produce anything? I mean, it seems extraordinarily bad for young people's psychological well-being to say to them, don't aspire to anything.
Arthur, I'll just leap in here. I think you completely misinterpreted me in this respect. There was no way in my presentation that I ever said that young people should not aspire to economic growth, or that anybody should not. I was merely questioning the potential for the growth, for the economy to continue to grow indefinitely, and talked about the kind of limits that were present to actually suggest that might be the case. So please don't misinterpret me there. I was also more recently in the discussion around GDP flows, suggesting that we needed to start thinking more carefully about what it is that we're counting and what it is that's important in terms of those flows. So that in itself is, I guess, a more of an ethical question, a future-focused question. Should the flows of money in the economy be more focused on restoration and tangible ways of enabling future generations to survive, or should we still be giving huge credibility to other flows that have a negative impact or no impact at all on those long-term requirements?
Well, I would agree that GDP is a very poor measure. So, and I think that's the problem with framing this in terms of a GDP debate, as opposed to what it is that we should be trying to achieve with the economy. I mean, but you know, the mindset shouldn't be don't go out and produce something if you can produce something that's worthwhile.
But then, if I could comment, Arthur, the question is what is worthwhile? And the example you give is understandable to everyone. But suppose this music was doing harm to people, or suppose the activity was, you know, intensive dairying, which is contributing to the problems that Mike has been working on, all the problems of climate change, but we don't have a price mechanism or a regulatory framework which minimizes those problems. So that your son, yes, is going to be contributing to GDP and possibly contributing to his own well-being in a variety of ways, but in the long run, he's contributing to very damaging activities that are going to cost future generations an enormous amount to put right. So partly the whole issue here, Geoff, is really about the regulatory framework, isn't it?
Somebody should have told Mozart that. Well, you know, I mean, it doesn't follow that it's going to contribute to something that's negative, does it? Just because he's contributing to economic growth, that doesn't follow at all.
No. But my point, Geoff, is simply what contributes to growth and or well-being is going to depend on the nature of that activity, and there's there's an intertemporal aspect of this too, isn't there? So something might be contributing positively in the near term, but actually have a very damaging effect in the long run, because you're actually exceeding limits, which then collapse your capacity to do things.
Oh, absolutely. Some activities do. And that's why it's not useful, in my view, to conceptualize this in terms of GDP.
Sure.
I do though think we can maybe distinguish between restorative growth and something else, consumptive growth. I don't know what term you would give it, but restorative growth being growth that enables us to live within Earth's capacity, that rebuilds, restores, regenerates, and builds stocks, as opposed to focuses on those flows which GDP, as currently measured, tends to focus on. So, I mean, there was a paper in the collection of papers by Pierce talking about constant capital, this idea that we invest in the financial flows should invest in making a world which has sufficient resources for the future generation to use, which then they can pass on to the one after, rather than focusing on short-term gains or valueless bubbles. And to me, that somewhere in here, there's a need to distinguish between the kinds of growth that we are after. And as I said, in my mind, I'm thinking restorative versus consumptive, but I'm sure there are some very smart economists out there who've thought about other ways of wording that idea.
Yeah.
Thanks, Janet. Geoff, did you want to comment, or Mike? Otherwise, we'll go to some further questions.
Well, I just wanted to pick up the comment about Mozart. Because Mozart is a beautiful example of something done 2 centuries ago, which continues to resonate and give pleasure and will continue to do so for a long time in the future. So when Janet talks about, what can people aspire to achieve, it's quite worthwhile thinking, can they aspire to achieve something that really will resonate down future generations as a solid benefit? It may be that Arthur's Son's music will be of Mozart's caliber. I can't judge it because it's not released yet. But
he wasn't writing symphonies at 7, though, so I don't know.
But I do think you have to distinguish between the Mozarts who genuinely leave humanity better off and the Exxon Mobils who possibly don't.
Yep.
I probably shouldn't say this, but our electric car, which I probably shouldn't have from Mike's point of view, is able to pick up a Romanian radio station which plays Mozart 24/7, which I listen to just about every time I go in the car. So like you, Arthur, I very much appreciate Mozart. Mike, did you want to comment? Otherwise, we'll go to some... No, okay. So there's a question here from Wallace Ray. Should we have a population limit for New Zealand? Very interesting one. I was at a gathering yesterday in which a very senior public servant said it's a tragedy sort of for New Zealand that we've never had a population policy. I don't know what the person thought the population policy should be, but anyway, the issue of population often comes up in these sorts of conversations. So does anybody wish to comment? Geoff, you did refer to infanticide as one of the ways in which particular communities have sought to manage their biophysical limits in the past.
Well, there's your problem. There is always a limit to population. Like it or not, Malthus continues to have a solid grain of truth that if you expand the numbers beyond what is a sustainable number given the carrying capacity of the space that they're on, it will be limited. It may be plague, it may be war, it may be famine. One or another of the biophysical checks ultimately limits population. So the question about what you do within those limits is a matter of genuine choice. Should we have a population policy in New Zealand? Well, I suppose we should, but we would need to think very carefully about exactly what that policy is and what the implications are. As I mentioned earlier, you can envisage a New Zealand which sets itself up as a little island of affluence and prosperity and manageable population in a global setting where the Malthusian checks become much more pressing and damaging. And how you balance the self-interest of the people who are already here in New Zealand against what would be the interests of the mass of humanity elsewhere on the planet, I think is a really difficult question. And it's not one that economists are going to be well placed to answer. It's a philosophical issue.
Mm. Janet or Mike? Janet?
Can I just say that Malthus lived in an era where they didn't actually realize that the best way of controlling population is to give women education. And this is incredibly well established, and I think that we need to turn our minds to social and equitable solutions to this population problem, rather than see it as the problem of those out there who will eventually die off through pestilence or whatever. So let's take a positive view on this. The question of New Zealand's ultimate population, I think, is a really difficult one, but I would say that I think that increasingly we are going to be faced by climate migrants, particularly from the Pacific, which will have enormous implications for New Zealand. And we'll probably also have incredibly wealthy climate migrants from other parts of the world. And so I think it's more important to turn our minds to how are we going to grapple with these very real and pressing issues, and to what extent are our borders going to be open, because as a nation, we've never really faced the migrant issue prior. And are we going to be supportive and encouraging, or are we going to have a sense that we should close our borders? And this is, I think, a really critical issue for us to grapple with today.
Thank you, Janet. Mike?
I just wanted to mention that I don't think it's hard to talk about just New Zealand, but a tiny proportion of the human population have most of the impact. It's not about numbers of people, it's about consumption and levels of affluence and the impact they have. So I always feel uncomfortable with that population argument. It's way more about distribution than it is about population.
Thank you, Geoff. All right. Now, there was a number of other comments in the chat session. There's one for me, which from Robert, which I think I might pass on, Robert, simply to say, I think this is from perhaps another occasion. It's a question around the Welsh legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act, and the institutions that's established, notably the Welsh Commissioner for the Future. And the question is about whether that's relevant for New Zealand. I think maybe this is an issue we could have a useful discussion on when we're thinking about institutions for sustainability and so forth. So maybe we come back to that. There's a comment then from Rafe about A growth. There's a comment from Nathan, and there's a comment from, in fact, there's a comment from Murray. Is it? Yes. So maybe we go to Murray. If economic counts don't include real stocks and flows, including sinks and capacities, then they're flying blind. Well, maybe, Geoff, you could just quickly comment on that, because GDP measures flows, it doesn't measure stocks. So you can be running down your stocks, you can be despoiling your sinks or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily show up in GDP, at least until you hit certain barriers. Do you want to quickly comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it shouldn't be in GDP specifically. GDP is about flows, and purely about flows. The stocks analysis is the question of national wealth or global wealth. And there's work going on always in national income accounting, attempting to quantify and measure those. And the framework for sustaining them has been going round and round since that definitions of sustainability was debated back in the 1980s and 90s, whether we are looking at hard sustainability, that is preserving stocks as they are, or whether we're allowing substitution so that we are sustaining the same capabilities over time to support levels of GDP flows. And I think generally it's agreed that soft sustainability is where you have to go. Hard sustainability, it just gets too hard too quickly. But on the other hand, you do need to keep in mind the sort of things that Mike is talking about, because that's where the hard sustainability constraints do bite. To run with soft sustainability, you have to have the substitutability, the technological options open that enable you to replace one resource as it is depleted with another that doesn't deplete. And we really do not know whether that is physically feasible or not, and to what extent. And to the extent that it's not feasible, Mike's view of the future is where we're going.
All right. I mean, perhaps, Arthur has rightly raised the question, should we be focused on GDP and biophysical limits or other measures? And Geoff, as you've indicated, GDP is only one of a range of measures. It only measures flows. It doesn't measure stocks. There are measures of stocks. They've been much debated. They're continuing to be refined. But there's also, of course, other ways of conceptualizing what we should be aiming at in terms of whatever progress, which includes obviously various notions of living standards, well-being, welfare, and so on and so forth. I'd simply comment, though, that the focus on GDP certainly hasn't gone away in the media, locally or internationally. Almost daily, there are reports, from international organizations, from governments reporting their GDP figures and what they expect them to be next year. So while we might have serious and intellectually valid reservations about GDP as a measure and as a goal, it's still very dominant in public discourse. Nathan has got a question here, and we've just got a couple more minutes. So if I could just quickly summarize this. He says, given the biophysical limits now apparent, should we be able to talk about the reality that we can't sustain what we have in anything vaguely approaching its current form? We're facing a 50% decline in all liquid fuel supply over 15 years or so due to the highest rate of supply having been reached, etc., etc. Do we have a 100-year perspective? What utopia bounded by entropy should be aiming for? And have any of you read Samuel Alexander's Entropia, which attempts to paint that picture? So any quick responses to that now before we need to wrap up? Janet? Mike?
I just wanted to say that it's come up a couple of times here, this whether it's the end of fossil fuels or the fact that we have to stop using them for climate change reasons. I see that the same thing. I just use this kind of metaphor of a pair of scissors or a pair of secateurs that are chopping your finger off. It doesn't matter which of the two blades has the most pressure on it, the finger's still going to get chopped off. So I think they're just combined forces that we have to think about. And yes, I have read Entropia, and it's given me a lot of hope about the future. So yeah, I'm probably the only one that has, I suspect.
I'll fess up, I haven't read it. In a sense, the question is a systemic one. Can capitalism survive this particular crisis? And capitalism is a system with a lot of adaptive ability. It's also a system with really serious limitations because of the fact that it's driven by the quest for profit, and because profit does tend to require growth. And so I see this as a question really of what economic system potentially can respond in a way that enables humanity to survive through the next century. And I think the jury is out. I have an open mind on whether capitalism is going to be able to reinvent itself to face a 50% decline in fuel supply over 15 years. History suggests it's probably going to give it a good shot, but I'm not sure that I can bet on the outcome.
Janet?
Yeah, so, I mean, for me, taking that 100-year view is the one that has to become absolutely fundamental to all the decisions we make. So decisions of national investment, decisions around infrastructure, decisions around what kind of business investments we make. But I think one thing that is becoming very evident is that we have essentially reached peak wealth. It's certainly looking like that. I don't think that as a globe the average wealth of people can be expected to get a lot greater because of the biophysical limits that we're already facing. And in fact, to live within the limits, I strongly suspect that the ways that we live are going to have to change to much lower levels of consumption, much lower expectations of the trappings of wealth, but on the other hand, much greater social and psychological positivity, I think, could potentially flow from that. And I think we've seen, again, from the COVID experience, how slowing down, how doing less, how becoming much more localized can actually have benefits for people's well-being, accepting that some people were in a really bad situation and did not appreciate have those kind of benefits, but more generally, there is huge potential in a future in which we do not consume so much and therefore don't ask so much of our economic system in terms of flow through of resources.
All right, well, look, thank you, Janet. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to those who have been participating in this conversation. As highlighted at the beginning, I was hoping this would be the first of perhaps an ongoing series of conversations. We've traversed a wide range of issues, but we've also traversed many of them very fleetingly. So I would welcome input and advice as we think about future webinars over the coming months and years, and advice particularly on the specific issues that people would like to focus on in more detail. I'm conscious, for example, we really haven't dealt in much depth with specific resource constraints. Mike has raised the issue of the energy return on investment. That's an issue that potentially could be the subject of a dedicated conversation. We haven't talked a great deal about the absorptive capacity of the biosphere and the issues that raises, particularly in relation to climate change, for example, and the issues around decarbonisation, though Mike has rightly raised the issue of the resource constraints and perhaps the energy constraints on decarbonisation and achieving what needs to be done in order to stabilise the climate system. We've touched briefly on issues of substitutability, but that's another big topic area. We've talked briefly about adaptability and the capacity of our socio-political systems to respond to the crises that we face. Again, those will be areas where we could potentially dedicate a specific session. So there's a wide range of issues here. I'm very appreciative of the contributions that Janet, Mike and Geoff have made, but I'd also welcome feedback and comments on the kind of conversation that people would like to continue. Just a couple of other things. Obviously, the Climate Change Commission will be issuing its draft budgets, I think, in February next year. Budgets for emissions for the period 2022 to 2035. That's obviously going to be an important development in New Zealand's tackling of climate change issues. Globally, there are important reports coming up. Obviously, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report and the review of the economics of biodiversity that is being undertaken for the British Treasury. So a range of important topics that could be the subject of future webinars. But for now, if I could just thank everybody and wish you well, and look forward to further conversations. So thank you very much, and all the very best.